Welcome to episode 12 of Project Stresa, a timeline which starts at the point of divergence of Austria being admitted to Germany in 1919. After the desperate offense of the Saxon Allies towards the Comintern in the joint operations of Alexander and Barbarossa, Germany and Poland had reached an agreement where Germany received Danzig in exchange for recognizing Poland's claims in Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. While this has upset most of the populations in the area, the Russian collaboration is performing much better than our timeline, as the democratic Germans are much more lenient to the local population than our history. While the Saxon Allies managed to gain significant land against the Comintern, the Latin Axis gained significant allies. The entire continent of America is secured from European influence, as the United States of America and their new allies of Venezuela and Argentina occupy their claimed lands against Britain, and the Dutch are expelled from the continent. While America has failed to establish a naval connection with the Soviets, they successfully execute a large invasion of France, putting the Saxon Allies on the back foot in Europe for the first time since Operation Charles. While many expected the Blitz to continue, the American army had halted their advance as a measure of goodwill towards the Saxon Allies before they started negotiations. Tensions are high as the negotiations begin in Switzerland. The fate of Europe now lay in the hands of the diplomats, and not the soldiers. But would they succeed? While the Saxon Allies and Latin Axis would discuss fervently, there was one major concern that trumped all of these disputes. Would Germany and Britain agree to sell out their ally of Japan in exchange for peace in Europe? Germany was in favor of such an agreement. Peace in Western Europe would mean that they would be able to commit all of their forces to the destruction of the USSR. However, such an arrangement would cause Britain to lose their empire in its entirety, as India and the Edwardian government were key members of the Latin Axis, and their claims would need to be respected. While the USA could ensure that the Edwardian government would only claim British colonies in the American continent, India would not budge until the entirety of the subcontinent was under their control, and America had agreed to such an arrangement. There was also the matter of Italy's claim to empire. They wished for all of Egypt, Sudan, and some extra territorial concessions to their Italian East African colony, which would need to be restored. While British colonies in Africa and Oceania, in theory, wouldn't be touched, their empire would have shrunk an incredible amount, and the Germans would have gone away with an increase of the size of their country, nearly restoring themselves to the glory of the German Empire of old. Germany would find Britain's apprehension incredibly hypocritical, as now the British suffered the same fate as the German Empire. But the British would not listen. They would stonewall any measures that restricted their empire's size, demanding the destruction of the Edwardian government and the restoration of their empire with only few concessions at the very least. While the negotiations and ceasefire between the Saxon Allies and Latin Axis were ongoing, the Germans were given a great advantage in their push eastwards. More assets that had been assigned to the Western Front were sent to the Eastern Front as the German forces marched to Stalingrad. The Soviets did not need spies to know that this city was the main objective of their advance. They too recognized the incredible strategic position that it provided to their southern thrust, so it was heavily fortified by troops. However, that would not stop the Germans from entering the city. The Soviets were fighting harder than ever before to protect the city of steel. Soviet generals soon began drafting plans for an encirclement of the German forces in the city, hoping to turn Stalingrad into a trap for the German forces. For now, the Germans were unaware of this potential risk and continued their assault in the city, hoping to secure it fully before the negotiations hopefully succeed. While Britain's desperate claim to their empire would restrict negotiations significantly, there is also the matter of American loans to consider. After the World War, America had granted significant loans to both nations in different ways in order to rebuild their economies. It had even gotten so contentious that the USA and Britain would have significant decline in relations, as Britain was desperate to get rid of American influence in their economy. While the Americans refused to change the loan interest on the British loans, Germany had its burdens lessened due to the Dawes Plan. But now America was paying the price of their graciousness of limiting the severity of the German loans. America demanded that the Germans and British pay back their loans, plus significant interest as war reparations. The British and Germans utterly refused such demands, as it would essentially allow for America to dominate their economies without needing to occupy their countries, essentially no different than a total occupation of them. Ultimately, due to these irreconcilable differences, the American Saxon Allies summit would fail, and Dewey would return home to America having broken his primary campaign promise. Dewey's failure to secure peace was an incredible humiliation to America. While the pro-war faction would be grateful that Dewey at least attempted to ensure America's national interests and refused to lay down and accept Saxon Allied demands, those who had sympathy for the Saxon Allies would be outraged. Norman Thomas and the Socialist Party of America would be especially outraged, as the preferred candidate to establish some level of peace had refused to fulfill his campaign promise. In response to this failure, the Socialist Party of America would call for a general strike, with the only unnegotiable demand being the American withdrawal from the Atlantic War. While the notion of a general strike sounds incredibly concerning for America, the SPA would have only gained a small amount of extra influence in the state, meaning that the general strike would only take effect in the larger industrial regions with more unions, like Chicago. The communists in America would actually support this general strike, despite the fact that the Atlantic War continuing would allow for the Soviets to avoid the fate of being destroyed. They also saw this general strike as a perfect opportunity to stage a revolution and spread communism to America. That, and the conservatives have already lumped them in with the socialists anyway, so a united front had to be established. While the general strike was concerning, Dewey would not trigger a federal response to the strike. His concern was, if he were to order the strike to be forcibly quashed, a revolution would occur and destroy America. However, Dewey's inaction would only make things worse, as now the pro-war Democrats were organizing paramilitaries and cracking down on left-wing demonstrations. The pro-war Democrats would see Germany as the orchestrator of this general strike, as currently, the SPD in Germany were leading, and the Socialist Party of America shared similar aims to them. This would convince many in America that there was an enemy within, a socialist enemy, that had to be rooted out at any cost. Because of Dewey's inaction to suppress the strike, the public's opinion of the Republican Party would vanish overnight. This event is deeply traumatic for America. Even if the Socialist Party of America were to stand down eventually, the damage has already been done, as America drifts further and further into fascism. Despite this strike, the Americans commit fully to the war once again in an attempt to assert themselves and get a better deal out of the peace negotiations. After news of the negotiations between Britain and the USA for peace in Europe, Australia and New Zealand had felt incredibly sidelined. Thanks to Edwardian propaganda, they had been erroneously told that Britain would have abandoned them in order to preserve their regime in Britain. This would have allowed Japan to take Australia and New Zealand as puppet states without any contest. At this time, Australia and New Zealand were extremely xenophobic, with Australia having White Australia laws in place to avoid Asians from settling in their state. The idea of being abandoned by their king when they had been such loyal soldiers in the Battle of Gallipoli was infuriating. Thus, Australia and New Zealand both would pass laws to recognize Edward as their true king, and immediately swore fealty to the Edwardian government. By attempting to avoid their destiny, they had played right into the hands of the Japanese, as they diverted their troops and navy to occupy Australia and New Zealand. If they were to succeed, there would be no stopping Japan from performing similar exercises in their allies' colonies with the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. However, this sudden turn of events is exactly the opportunity that the Americans were waiting for. The Americans quickly went on the offensive, seeking to link up with Australia and New Zealand to begin their island hopping campaign, and they did so with great success. This is mostly because Japan lacked the oil to supply their ships, as the Southern Thrust's success also destroyed their oil supply. As more and more Japanese troops were diverted away from garrisoning their flimsy puppet regimes in China and Russia, communist resistance cells were triggered as the second phase of the War of Resistance began, this time with the direct collaboration of Russian and Chinese partisans. While initially, Alexander and Barbarossa had succeeded. They quickly realized that they had overextended. The peace talks with the USA granted the Saxon Allies an opportunity to push further into Comintern land. But now that the USA had resumed their hostilities, the USA was able to gain a huge advantage, as the Free French government is pushed out of Paris, and the Americans begin attempting to march into Germany proper. In an attempt to circumvent the natural defenses of Alsace-Lorraine, the Americans would invade Belgium in order to pass the Ardennes. With these sudden advances into France and their slow incursions into the Rhineland, more and more troops had to be diverted from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. The Germans would hastily retreat out of Stalingrad, being sure to blow up any vital infrastructure on their way out. The Soviets had been on the back foot for far too long. While the southern thrust was the great victory, the Saxon Allies had continuously occupied their country. No more. With insurrections happening in Siberia, the resumption of Latin Axis and Saxon Allied hostilities, Operation Alexander's stalling, and the lack of a Japanese advance, it was time, finally, to execute the Soviet counterattack, Operation Bagration. The Germans are caught off guard by the Soviet counterattack. The siege of Leningrad is broken. The Russian fascists are pushed further east. Soon, all foreign occupiers will be expelled from the motherland, and the revolution will spread to Eurasia, and soon the world. The workers of Stalingrad soon continued their endeavor to produce arms for the motherland. The steel factories were quickly brought into operation, and while the occasional bombing run would fall, they were used to such harassment. Even before the Germans attempted to capture the city, bombers were frequently sent as a way to attempt to disrupt the steel production of the city. Their desperate attempts to suppress the workers' state were pitiable, as these liberated workers would endure any hardships for the sake of the workers of the world. However, this bombing run would be the last to soar over Stalingrad. On May 1st, 1944, International Workers' Day, war changed forever. German bombers dropped their secret weapon, the first atomic bomb, Fenrir, on Stalingrad. The city of steel became the city of ash within seconds as Fenrir consumed the city. The railway station, the steel factory, vanished. And those who worked inside, and those who were defending the city, were either dead from the explosion or soon to die due to radiation poisoning. The experimental weapon of the Germans was deployed with results that exceeded their greatest expectations. Now, the world would tremble before the might of the Saxon Allies, as the German Wunderwaffen were unleashed against their foes.